An elderly woman asks for a simple glass of water on a flight. Sounds harmless, right? But when the flight attendant refuses, things quickly spiral out of control. 4 minutes later, she's fired on the spot. What happened in those minutes that changed everything? Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just another routine flight from New York to Miami. The plane had taken off on time, and the usual hum of the engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. The crew moved up and down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, while the rest of the passengers relaxed or tried to sleep. Everything seemed normal, until a small, seemingly innocent moment set off a chain of events that would lead to a dramatic outcome. At around 20 minutes into the flight, an elderly woman in the middle row raised her hand. She had been sitting quietly for most of the journey, but now she looked a bit uncomfortable. Her face had flushed slightly, and she seemed to be having trouble adjusting the air vent above her seat. She caught the eye of one of the flight attendants, a young woman named Emily, who was making her way down the aisle. "Excuse me," the elderly woman said, her voice gentle but clear. "Could I please get a glass of water? I'm feeling a bit parched." Emily paused for a moment. She had been busy moving from one passenger to the next, and she clearly had a lot on her plate. The flight was near full capacity, and there were numerous requests coming in. It was one of those flights where everything felt like it needed to be done in a hurry, but the elderly woman wasn't asking for anything extravagant, just a simple glass of water. Emily glanced at the woman, looked around at the busy cabin, and then responded, "I'm sorry, but we're not serving water right now. Maybe in a few minutes," she said, walking away quickly without waiting for a reply. It wasn't an outright refusal, but it certainly didn't feel like the polite offer most passengers were used to. The elderly woman, confused and a little taken aback, sat back in her seat. She tried to make herself comfortable, but the discomfort was still there. Her hands fidgeted in her lap as she waited. A few minutes passed. The flight attendants continued their rounds, and the woman, still thirsty, raised her hand again. This time, Emily was a bit farther down the aisle. She saw the hand up, but instead of heading over right away, she slowed her pace, clearly reluctant. The elderly woman's request had been simple, but something about this moment seemed to have thrown Emily off. When she finally made her way over, the woman repeated her request. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but I really need some water." This time, Emily's response was sharper. "I said we'll get to you in a bit. Please wait." She turned away, barely making eye contact as she continued with her duties. For a moment, the elderly woman stared at her, unsure of what had just happened. She had flown many times before and knew how things worked. But today, something felt wrong. She sat back in her seat, still parched and now slightly upset. Passengers nearby overheard the exchange and started looking at each other, some confused, others clearly uncomfortable with the interaction. The tension didn't last long, but it was there, lingering in the air. Most passengers went back to their own business, but a few exchanged looks, sensing something wasn't quite right. What was just an ordinary flight had now taken a turn, but no one could have predicted what would come next. As the flight continued, the elderly woman remained visibly uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat, glancing up at the flight attendants as they moved around the cabin. Her throat was dry, and the heat from the overhead vents wasn't helping. It wasn't just about the water anymore. It was about being treated with respect and care, something she had come to expect from airline staff over the years. Around 30 minutes later, Emily walked down the aisle again, this time holding a tray with drinks for other passengers. She passed the elderly woman, who, perhaps frustrated, gently called out to her once more, "Excuse me, but I really need that water now." Emily stopped briefly, her expression blank. She looked down at the woman, but her response was flat. "I told you, I can't get to you right now. You'll have to wait." She didn't even pause to explain or offer a more polite response. It was as if the woman's request wasn't worth her time. The elderly woman's face flushed slightly, not from anger, but from the humiliation of being dismissed. Around her, the other passengers were beginning to notice. Some were frowning. and a couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. But Emily didn't seem to notice the shift in the atmosphere. She turned quickly and walked away, leaving the elderly woman sitting there, growing more and more uncomfortable as the minutes ticked by. There was an undeniable tension building in the air now. It was subtle but noticeable. What was once a simple minor request had now become something far more serious. The elderly woman had been denied not once but twice, and the discomfort was starting to feel like something that went beyond just the lack of water. The other passengers were starting to whisper among themselves, and the feeling that something wasn't right was growing. By now, the elderly woman wasn't just asking for water. She was asking for common courtesy, for the basic decency that any passenger should expect. And as Emily moved on, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, wondering how long this would continue. As the flight progressed, the discomfort in the cabin started to shift. What had been a minor issue was now an uncomfortable focal point for several passengers. A few had started speaking in low tones, wondering why the elderly woman had been denied such a simple request. Some passengers felt uneasy, sensing that Emily's dismissive attitude was uncalled for. Others felt sympathy for the woman, sitting in silence as she tried to manage her discomfort. About 10 minutes after the second refusal, the elderly woman pressed her call button. This time, the moment she pressed it, Emily was only a few rows away. She had no excuse to ignore the request this time, but as the bell rang out, she looked around the cabin and hesitated. For a brief moment, Emily stood still, staring at the button. The hesitation was obvious. Her stress was beginning to show, and it was clear she wasn't handling the situation well. She had been running from one task to the next all flight, and it seemed the elderly woman's repeated requests were starting to get under her skin. Finally, she made her way over to the woman's seat, but there was no warmth in her step. The elderly woman looked up, a slight expression of relief on her face, but that soon faded when Emily stood in front of her. "I really don't think you should keep asking for water," Emily said, her tone cold and dismissive. "You've already been told, and I'm not going to repeat myself." Her words were blunt and harsh, and they caught the elderly woman off guard. Some of the nearby passengers visibly shifted in their seats, taken aback by the sudden change in tone. One man a few rows ahead looked back, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what was happening. The cabin, once filled with quiet chatter, now seemed to hold an uncomfortable stillness. It was as if everyone was waiting for something to give, unsure of how to respond to the growing tension. The elderly woman, now more than just thirsty, felt a wave of frustration rise within her. She had never expected to be treated like this, especially not on a flight she had taken countless times before. She wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she quietly lowered her head, resigned, but still hoping that the situation might improve. Emily, meanwhile, had started to walk away again, seemingly done with the interaction. But as she moved, the elderly woman's voice cracked through the silence, low but firm. "Please, I'm just asking for some water. Why can't you help me?" Emily froze mid-step. There was a brief moment of silence, a split second where it seemed like the whole plane might be holding its breath. But instead of responding with any compassion or acknowledgement, Emily turned, exhaled loudly, and continued on her way without another word. That was the breaking point. What could have been a minor disagreement had now escalated, and everyone around her could feel it. The tension was palpable. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some with expressions of disbelief, others shaking their heads, unsure of what to make of the situation. The elderly woman's request was simple. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She wasn't demanding anything extraordinary. But somehow, in the midst of all this, she had become the target of indifference, and the cabin was starting to feel like it was on the verge of something much bigger. As the flight continued, the situation only seemed to grow worse. The elderly woman, who had tried to stay composed, now looked visibly distressed. Her face was pale, and her hands, which had been resting in her lap, were now clenched tightly. Her discomfort was no longer just physical. It was emotional too. It wasn't just about the water anymore. It was the way she had been treated. The cabin was still quiet, but there was a sense of unease hanging in the air. A few passengers had started to murmur to each other, casting glances toward the front of the plane. The flight attendants, who had been working in pairs, began to notice the shift in the atmosphere. One of them, a senior attendant named Laura, had seen the exchange between Emily and the elderly woman. She had been busy with another row but had caught the tail end of it. After finishing her tasks, Laura made her way down the aisle, pausing when she saw Emily standing near the cockpit, talking to another attendant. Laura watched Emily for a moment, sensing something was off. It wasn't like Emily to act this way. She was usually calm and collected, even under pressure. But now, Emily was pacing nervously, her eyes darting around the cabin. Without saying anything, Laura approached the elderly woman's row. As she did, she caught the woman's eye and gave her a small, sympathetic nod. The woman didn't speak, but Laura could tell she was uncomfortable. "I'm sorry about the wait, ma'am," Laura said gently. "Let me get you some water right away." The elderly woman, too stunned to respond immediately, finally nodded, her lips trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. As Laura walked to the galley to fetch the water, she noticed a few passengers glancing her way. There was a subtle shift in the mood of the cabin. People were starting to take sides. Some passengers looked relieved, while others still seemed unsure of how to react to the situation. The atmosphere had become thick with tension. Meanwhile, Emily, still pacing near the front, began to notice the change. A few passengers had started whispering about the incident, and it wasn't long before the whispers grew louder. Emily's eyes darted nervously as she overheard some of the passengers discussing the way she had treated the elderly woman. She felt her stomach tighten, realizing that the situation was quickly spiraling beyond her control. But instead of trying to diffuse the tension or apologize, she tried to ignore it, hoping it would just blow over. But as Laura returned with the water, Emily's discomfort only grew. She watched from a distance as Laura handed the elderly woman the glass, her face still filled with a subtle expression of apology. The elderly woman took the glass, her hands shaking as she drank the water. For a brief moment it seemed like everything might settle down, but the damage had already been done. The passengers around her were still watching, and the whispers continued. What had started as a small mistake was now turning into a larger issue, a moment that no one, least of all Emily, could ignore anymore. As the elderly woman slowly drank the water, a sense of calm returned to her for the first time in what felt like hours. Her hands steadied, and her breath seemed to return to normal. For a moment it almost seemed like the storm had passed, but the ripple effect from the earlier exchange was far from over. Emily stood by the galley, her back to the cabin, but her posture tense. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her. It wasn't just the elderly woman's issue now. It had become a matter of how the whole cabin perceived her. The tension had become palpable, and even those who hadn't witnessed the earlier exchange could feel that something was off. Some were visibly unsettled, others whispered among themselves, and a few even shot her disapproving glances. Emily tried to push it out of her mind, focusing on her duties, but she couldn't ignore the murmurs. The situation was escalating, and she knew, deep down, that her behavior had played a large part in it. But instead of taking accountability or attempting to diffuse things, Emily doubled down, her pride getting in the way. She didn't want to admit that she might have mishandled the situation. It was just a small mistake, right? She tried to convince herself that it wasn't as big a deal as the passengers were making it out to be. But as the flight wore on, things only got worse. The elderly woman's discomfort had not gone unnoticed. A couple of the passengers in the rows behind her had quietly spoken up, asking if she was all right. One woman seated nearby leaned over and asked if the flight attendant had been rude to her. The elderly woman, still not quite sure how to respond, nodded. Word spread quickly. It wasn't long before another flight attendant, a supervisor named Kelly, entered the picture. She had been informed of what had transpired and had heard the murmurs growing louder throughout the cabin. She wasn't one to stand by when passengers were upset or when things started to spiral out of control. She approached Emily, who was still standing off to the side, looking increasingly anxious. Kelly gave Emily a sharp look, one that immediately communicated she was aware of the situation. "Emily," she said, her voice low but firm. "I need to speak with you. Now." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had no idea what Kelly was going to say, but she knew it wasn't going to be good. As Kelly led her toward the back of the plane, Emily couldn't help but glance at the passengers around her, who were now watching with an almost eerie quietness. They all knew something was about to happen. Once they reached the rear of the plane, Kelly turned to Emily with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "What were you thinking?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with a quiet anger. "You can't treat passengers like that, especially not someone who was asking for something as simple as water." Emily didn't respond immediately. She opened her mouth as if to explain, but the words didn't come. She felt a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. Kelly wasn't the type to make empty threats, and from the look in her eyes, Emily knew there were consequences looming. "Listen," Kelly continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "You've got to understand it's not about being busy or stressed. You're here to help people. If you can't do that, then this job isn't for you." She paused for a beat, allowing her words to sink in. Emily stood there, silent. The weight of the situation was starting to hit her, but it was too late for apologies now. What had started as a small mistake, a simple act of refusing water, had now spiraled into something far more serious. The passengers could sense it, and soon so would her boss. The tension in the back of the plane was thick, and Emily felt as if the walls were closing in on her. She hadn't fully processed the weight of what Kelly had just said, but she knew things were quickly reaching a breaking point. There was no turning back now. Kelly's eyes didn't leave Emily as she spoke. "You can't let stress or frustration get the better of you, Emily. You're not just serving drinks, you're serving people. You've got to remember that every passenger, regardless of their request, deserves respect, especially someone who's clearly in discomfort." The words hung in the air, and Emily's mind raced. She had known in the back of her mind that something wasn't quite right about how she'd handled things, but she'd convinced herself that she was just doing her job. She was trying to keep everything running smoothly. But now, with Kelly's sharp gaze and the heavy realization settling in, she understood just how wrong her actions had been. "I didn't mean for it to escalate like this," Emily finally said, her voice quiet. She was speaking more to herself than to Kelly. "I was just so busy, and she kept asking for water. I didn't think it was a big deal." Kelly sighed, her expression softening slightly, but not with forgiveness. "That's the problem, Emily. It's not about the water. It's about how you handle requests. It's about empathy. Do you think the elderly woman was asking for something unreasonable? Do you think she deserved to be brushed off like that?" Emily's stomach churned. She had no response. She had been so caught up in the rush of the job and the pressure of managing multiple tasks that she hadn't even considered the woman's point of view. The woman wasn't trying to cause trouble. She was simply asking for basic care, something every passenger should expect. But Emily had dismissed her without a second thought. "I didn't realize it was that bad," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone was paying attention. I thought it would blow over." But Kelly wasn't done. She wasn't interested in excuses or justifications. "You know better than this. You're experienced. You've been on plenty of flights. The passengers notice everything, and they talk. Word spreads fast, Emily, especially when a passenger is treated badly." A chill ran through Emily as she processed that. Kelly was right. The entire cabin had seen it. Passengers had been talking. The murmurs, the whispers, the glances exchanged. It was all too clear now. It wasn't just about what had happened in the few minutes between Emily and the elderly woman. It was about how it had affected the entire flight. It wasn't just one passenger who was dissatisfied. It was everyone who had witnessed the interaction. Kelly's voice became more pointed. "This isn't just about the elderly woman. It's about the other passengers too. You've created a scene here. They saw you ignore someone in need, and now they're uncomfortable. This could have been handled so much differently. But now the damage is done. Emily felt the weight of those words, the reality of the situation starting to sink in deeper with each passing second. What could have been a minor issue had spiraled into a full-blown crisis, and it was her responsibility. She had failed to de-escalate the situation. Instead, she had made it worse. For a moment, silence hung between them. Kelly's gaze softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "You need to go back out there, apologize to the woman, and do better. But that's not enough. I'm pulling you off the rest of this flight. You're not serving anyone else for the rest of this trip." Emily's heart sank. She had known this was coming, but hearing it aloud felt like a punch to the gut. She had already made a mess of things, but now she was being removed from the flight. Her stomach twisted with embarrassment. The worst part wasn't even the consequences. It was the realization that she had let down both her passengers and herself. She had made a mistake, and now she was facing the fallout of it. I understand," Emily murmured, her voice shaky. She didn't have anything else to say. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. All she could think about was the elderly woman sitting in her seat, still probably feeling the sting of being dismissed. All the passengers who had seen her refuse a simple request were now judging her for it. Kelly nodded, her expression softening only slightly. "I'll speak to the captain. You're not in trouble yet, but this is serious. Take a seat in the back and stay out of the way for the rest of the flight." As Kelly turned to leave, Emily felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had failed to do what she had been trained to do. She had failed to care for the passengers in the way they deserved, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. She walked slowly toward the back of the plane, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. The rest of the flight would be a long one. As Emily made her way to the back of the plane, every step felt heavier than the last. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her as she passed. It wasn't just the elderly woman she had wronged now. It felt like the entire cabin was watching her, judging her for what had unfolded. She reached the last row and sat down, but the seat felt uncomfortable, almost foreign. Her mind raced, replaying every moment of the flight in rapid succession, each one feeling worse than the last. She had been trained for this job. She knew the protocols, the proper etiquette, the customer service standards. But in that moment, she had failed to follow through. The decision to refuse a simple request had set off a chain of events she wasn't prepared for. The discomfort of the elderly woman, the coldness of her own response, the awkwardness of the other passengers, it all blended together into a bitter feeling that was now weighing on her chest. As the flight continued, Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the soft murmur of the passengers around her. She could hear snippets of conversations, discussions about the incident, speculations on what would happen next, the general discontent that had built up over the course of the flight. It seemed like every passenger had an opinion about what had transpired. Some were critical of her behavior, while others simply felt bad for the elderly woman. It didn't matter. In Emily's mind, she was the one who had failed. Meanwhile, the elderly woman, who had been at the center of the storm, was now sitting quietly in her seat, the glass of water long gone. She had finished it in one long gulp, but it was clear that the issue had gone beyond just the physical need for hydration. It wasn't just about the water. It was about respect. It was about how she had been treated, how her request had been met with indifference, and that, more than anything, was the part that hurt. A few rows away, one passenger, a man in his mid-30s, had noticed the woman's discomfort and had started a quiet conversation with her. His voice was calm, and it seemed to put the elderly woman at ease, if only a little. Emily couldn't hear their words, but she saw the man gently nodding as the woman spoke. It was clear from their body language that they were discussing the situation, but there was a quiet respect in the way the man spoke to her, something Emily had failed to offer. In the midst of all this, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of guilt gnawing at her. The entire situation had spiraled so quickly that she hadn't had a chance to think about how to fix it before it was too late. She had dismissed the elderly woman, and in doing so, she had inadvertently dismissed every other passenger who had witnessed it. And now, the mood of the entire flight had shifted. It wasn't just the passengers who had noticed. Laura, the senior attendant who had initially stepped in to offer the woman water, had also been watching the situation unfold. She had seen Emily walk to the back of the plane, looking defeated. But Laura wasn't done yet. She knew this wasn't a simple mistake. It was a breakdown in professionalism. She couldn't just let it slide. She made her way to the back of the plane, her eyes scanning the cabin for Emily. When she spotted her sitting by the last row, Laura approached, her steps measured but purposeful. She didn't speak right away, but instead sat down beside Emily. There was no reprimanding in Laura's demeanor, but there was a quiet seriousness in her presence. Emily avoided her gaze, staring straight ahead at the empty seats across from her. She could feel Laura's eyes on her, waiting for her to say something, to admit what had gone wrong. But Emily didn't know what to say. What was there to say? She had messed up, and now everything had gone sideways. After a few moments of silence, Laura finally spoke. "Emily, I'm not here to scold you. I know how stressful this job can be, but you've got to understand something important. You're not just serving drinks or snacks. You're dealing with people's lives, their comfort, and sometimes their emotions. Every decision you make, whether it's big or small, affects someone." Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Laura's words hit harder than she expected. She had known this all along, but had let the pressure of the job cloud her judgment. She hadn't taken a moment to stop and think about the person sitting in front of her, or the people who had been watching. She had simply reacted out of frustration, and now it was all falling apart. Laura continued, her voice soft but firm. "You need to reflect on how you want to move forward. This job, this responsibility, requires a level of care. When we lose that, it's hard to get it back. People will remember how you made them feel more than anything else. And that's the part that hurts the most." Emily finally turned her head to look at Laura, meeting her gaze for the first time. She could see the disappointment in Laura's eyes, but she also saw something else, a sense of understanding. Laura had been where she was, under pressure, tired, and overwhelmed. But Laura had learned how to handle those moments. Emily hadn't. "I know," Emily said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean for it to get like this." Laura gave her a small nod. "I know, but it did. And now you need to decide if you're going to learn from this or let it define you. You have a choice." Emily's chest tightened as the weight of her mistake became clearer. It wasn't just about the firing that was likely to come. It was about how she had handled herself in that moment, and how it affected everyone around her. The elderly woman, the passengers, even Emily herself. She had let something small snowball into a much bigger problem, and now, as the plane continued its journey, she was left with the consequences of her actions. It was a long flight back, not because of the time or distance, but because Emily knew that no matter what happened next, she would never forget the lesson she had learned the hard way. The hours seemed to drag on as the flight neared its destination. Emily sat silently, still in the last row, staring at the cabin in front of her, her mind running through every detail of the past few hours. The hum of the engines was no longer a comforting sound. It was a constant reminder of the tension that hung in the air. Every few minutes she would glance up, catching the eyes of some passengers, only to quickly look away, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over her. It felt as though the whole plane knew what had happened. The weight of their judgment was almost unbearable. Despite the quiet mutterings from some passengers, the cabin had settled into an uneasy silence. The elderly woman, who had been the catalyst for everything that went wrong, was no longer the center of attention. Her discomfort, once so obvious, had quieted down after receiving the water she needed. But Emily knew that her own discomfort wouldn't fade as easily. She had let down a person who simply needed kindness. Worse yet, she had let down everyone else who had witnessed her actions. The passengers who had seen it unfold would remember the moment, and those who had only heard whispers would remember the rumors. Emily knew she'd be the one they all talked about when they disembarked. The cabin crew, too, seemed more distant. Laura and Kelly hadn't spoken to her since their brief exchange in the back of the plane, and Emily had taken her seat quietly, too ashamed to approach either of them. She kept her head down, trying to make herself as small as possible, hoping that time would somehow erase the sting of the situation. But she knew it wouldn't. At some point during the flight, the captain came on the intercom to announce that they would be descending into Miami soon. The usual cheerful tone was absent, replaced by a more neutral voice, and Emily couldn't help but wonder if he too knew what had happened. The flight had been anything but normal, and though the announcement was meant to signal the end of the journey, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this particular flight would never feel finished for her. It was one thing to be criticized or reprimanded by a supervisor, but knowing that her actions had been so visible to the passengers, many of whom she would likely never see again, was something she couldn't easily move past. In the last hour of the flight, Emily found herself reflecting on the bigger picture. How had things gone so wrong in such a short time? She wasn't a bad person, she knew that. She had always been committed to her job, always tried to do her best. But something had shifted that day. She had been distracted by the pressures of the job, caught up in the busyness of the routine, and as a result, she had overlooked the basic decency that should have guided her actions. She had forgotten that being a flight attendant wasn't just about serving drinks or keeping people safe. It was about serving people with respect, kindness, and empathy. And she had failed to do that when it mattered most. As the plane began its descent, Emily found herself standing up to prepare for landing. She moved quickly, hoping to avoid any more uncomfortable interactions with passengers. She needed the distraction, but the quiet murmur of the cabin and the steady rise of the plane's descent only reminded her of how much she had messed up. When the seatbelt sign came on, Emily quietly made her way to the galley, keeping her eyes focused on the floor. She wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but she needed to do something to start making amends. She couldn't fix what had already happened, but maybe she could at least show that she was trying to learn from her mistake. As she stood at the front of the galley, waiting for the final instructions from Laura, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It startled her, and she turned to find the elderly woman standing behind her, her small frame bent slightly with age. Emily blinked, surprised, as she hadn't expected the woman to come up to her at all, but then she saw the kind expression in the woman's eyes, and her stomach turned with guilt. "Excuse me," the elderly woman said quietly, her voice soft but steady. "I just wanted to say thank you for the water earlier. I know it was a bit of a hassle, and I appreciate you getting it for me." Emily opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. She had expected the woman to be angry or upset, but instead the woman was offering gratitude. It stung even more, this small act of kindness, when Emily knew how badly she had treated her. The woman's smile was gentle, but Emily could see the pain behind it. She could tell that despite the woman's polite words, the moment had still hurt her. "I'm so sorry for the way I treated you," Emily finally said, her voice trembling. "You didn't deserve that. I should have been more patient and more understanding." The elderly woman nodded, her smile faltering slightly. "I know you were probably stressed," she said softly, her tone still warm. "But people need kindness, especially when they're not feeling well." Emily felt tears prick the back of her eyes. "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking, "and I failed you. I'm really sorry." For a moment there was only silence between them. Then, the elderly woman reached out and placed a hand gently on Emily's arm. "It's all right, dear," she said, her voice filled with understanding. "We all have our bad days. Just remember to be kinder next time." With that, the elderly woman turned and made her way back to her seat, leaving Emily standing there, stunned. For the first time since the incident had occurred, she felt the smallest flicker of hope that perhaps she could begin to make things right. The elderly woman's forgiveness didn't erase the mistake, but it reminded Emily that there was always room to do better. She couldn't change the past, but she could control her actions moving forward. As the plane touched down in Miami, Emily knew that the next steps were going to be difficult. She had likely lost her job, and her reputation among the passengers and her colleagues was forever altered. But there was one thing she could hold on to: the understanding that, even in the worst of times, There was always a chance for growth. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to learn from her mistakes, no matter the cost. The plane had touched down in Miami, and as the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers began to unbuckle and gather their things, preparing to disembark. But for Emily, the end of the flight didn't signal relief. It only intensified the pressure she had been feeling all day. The passengers slowly began to filter out of the plane, and she watched them go, their faces a blur, each one another reminder of what had just transpired. The last thing she wanted was to face Kelly or Laura, but she knew she couldn't avoid them forever. She had made a mistake, a big one, and as the other crew members finished their duties and prepared to leave the plane, Emily stayed behind. The cabin was nearly empty when Kelly approached her, her footsteps echoing in the now silent space. Emily stood up straight, her heart pounding. She had been dreading this moment. The confrontation, the inevitable discussion about what had gone wrong, the consequences. It was all weighing heavily on her mind. She didn't know what Kelly would say or do, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. Kelly stood in front of her, arms crossed, her expression neutral. Emily couldn't read her face. For a moment, it felt like the air between them was thick with the tension of everything unsaid. The noise of the plane's final preparations, the chatter of other flight attendants, the beeping of equipment, seemed distant, muffled, as if Emily was the only one on the plane. Finally, Kelly spoke. "I've already had a word with the captain. We're going to have to report this incident to the airline. You know that, right?" Emily nodded silently. She had been expecting that, but hearing it aloud made it feel all the more real. Kelly paused, letting that statement sink in. She was calm, but her tone had a sharp edge. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it, Emily. What you did today was unacceptable. The way you treated that passenger, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure in the most basic part of this job." Emily's chest tightened, her stomach sinking with each word. She wanted to defend herself, to explain how overwhelmed she had been, how she hadn't meant for it to get out of hand, but she couldn't find the right words. What was there to say? The truth was that she had failed to act with the compassion and professionalism she was trained for. Kelly went on, "I don't know what was going through your head, but I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've seen how quickly things can go wrong. But I've also seen how small acts of kindness can turn a situation around. You had a chance to fix it, and instead you made it worse." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. She knew Kelly wasn't trying to break her down, but every word stung like a needle, reminding her of just how far she had missed the mark. "I don't expect you to have all the answers right now," Kelly continued, her voice softening just a little. "But you've got to understand how serious this is. This isn't just about that one woman. It's about every person who expects to feel safe, comfortable, and cared for when they fly. And you didn't provide that today." Emily felt her face flush with shame, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. She had to own up to this, no matter how hard it was. Kelly took a deep breath and leaned against the galley counter, her gaze steady. "Look, Emily, I'm not going to say that this is the end for you, but you've got to think long and hard about how you approach this job in the future. It's not just about following the rules. It's about understanding the responsibility that comes with it." There was a pause before Kelly spoke again, more quietly now. "If you want to stay in this job, you need to show that you can learn from this. Not just to us, but to the passengers. You've got a lot of work to do, but that starts with taking accountability." Emily's heart felt heavy, but she knew Kelly was right. She had taken that first step by acknowledging the mistake. Now she had to prove that she could do better. Kelly studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "I'm going to report this, but I'll also make sure to let them know you've been trying to correct your actions. I'm not saying you'll keep your job, but I'll make that known. But the rest is on you." As Kelly walked away, leaving Emily standing alone in the galley, a mix of emotions flooded over her. It wasn't relief. No, there was no relief yet. It was more like a sudden clarity. She knew now that her actions hadn't just affected the elderly woman. They had affected her entire approach to this work. She had been so focused on doing things quickly and efficiently that she had forgotten the heart of the job: people. The whole point of her being there was to make sure passengers felt taken care of. She had lost sight of that, and the consequences were clear. But there was also a flicker of hope. She still had the chance to change. If the airline gave her another opportunity, she would do everything in her power to prove that she could be better. She knew she had a lot of work ahead of her, but the path forward had become a little clearer. As the final passengers made their way off the plane, Emily stood by the galley, staring out the window at the bright Miami skyline. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she'd keep her job or if she'd be asked to leave. But one thing was certain: she would never forget this day. It had shaken her to her core, but it had also reminded her of the importance of kindness and humility in every aspect of her life, not just at work. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and started walking toward the front of the plane. The day was far from over, but at least now, she had a better sense of where to go from here. The next few hours felt like they stretched on indefinitely for Emily. As the crew disembarked, she was left standing in the near-empty terminal, staring at her reflection in the glass of the airport gate. It was quiet now, but the noise inside her head was deafening. She replayed every single detail of the flight over and over again. The elderly woman's discomfort, her refusal to offer water, the way Emily had dismissed her so coldly, the silent judgment from the other passengers, and of course Kelly's words that would echo in her mind for days to come. You didn't provide that today. She was still in uniform, but somehow it felt like she was wearing a badge of failure. Every time she looked at herself, she saw someone who had made a massive mistake, a mistake that had affected more than just one passenger. It was a moment of carelessness that could have been easily avoided, yet she had let it snowball, turning a simple request for water into a crisis. The captain had spoken to her before the disembarkation, offering a few words of advice. He hadn't been angry, just disappointed. He had emphasized how crucial it was to maintain composure during moments of stress. "You're here to keep the peace, Emily," he had said quietly. "The rest can be managed, but the human element, that's where we make our mark." His words had been softer than Kelly's, but the message was the same. He had even asked if she was all right. "It's easy to let things slip," he added, "but it's what you do next that counts." It was those words that haunted her now. What do I do next? Emily stood in the terminal, feeling small, alone, and disconnected from everything around her. She knew her fate rested in the hands of the airline's management. She didn't know how they would view her actions, whether they'd see this as a minor lapse in judgment or as something more serious. She wasn't sure how much weight her previous experiences would hold in the decision. All she could do now was wait, and that uncertainty was eating at her. When she finally left the gate area, she wandered into the employee break room, hoping to find some distraction or even a few words of comfort. She wasn't sure why she thought it would help. None of her colleagues would understand what she had gone through today. It wasn't like they had seen the incident firsthand, and Emily didn't want to explain herself. She was tired of justifying her mistakes. Instead, she found a seat by the window, staring out at the aircraft parked on the tarmac. The hum of the airport around her seemed distant, like she was in a separate world, one where her actions felt like they had no place. It was then that Laura walked in. The senior flight attendant approached her quietly, without the usual cheerfulness she often carried. She wasn't here to reprimand Emily further, but the weight of the situation between them was undeniable. "You holding up okay?" Laura asked, her tone measured but not harsh. Emily didn't answer right away. She just stared down at her hands, which were resting on the table. Her uniform felt tighter now, almost suffocating. "I don't know," she said after a pause, her voice barely audible. "I think I messed up, really messed up." Laura sat down next to her presence calm and steady. "You did," she said simply but without judgment. "But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" The bluntness of Laura's words hit harder than anything else Emily had heard today. She had spent so much time blaming herself and trying to make sense of what went wrong that she hadn't really considered the next step. The question was simple, but it felt like a mountain to climb. What am I going to do about it? I don't know, Emily said again, this time with a hint of frustration. I don't know how to fix it. Laura leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. You're not going to fix it right away, Emily. But you can start by showing that you're willing to learn, not just to us, but to the people you're serving. Emily nodded slowly, but her mind was still racing. She had no idea what the airline's final decision would be. But she couldn't just let this moment define her forever. She wasn't the same person she had been when the flight took off. She had failed, yes, but that failure didn't have to be the end. You'll get another chance, Laura said, as if reading her mind. But you have to prove you can handle it. Show up with the right attitude, ask for feedback, and most importantly, take responsibility. The rest will follow. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of her mistake heavy on her shoulders, but her chest felt slightly less tight as she processed Laura's words. I can't change the past, she thought, but I can control what happens next. After a long moment of silence, Laura stood up. Don't beat yourself up too much. Everyone messes up. It's what you do afterward that counts. She gave Emily a gentle pat on the shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. You've got this. Just don't forget why you're here in the first place. It's about people, Emily. Always about people. As Laura left the room, Emily felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in hours. Hope. It was faint, but it was there. A small reminder that it wasn't too late to change, that there was still a chance for redemption, but only if she was willing to face the hard truth and put in the work. She sat there for a while longer, letting the words sink in. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe the road ahead would be filled with more challenges and moments of self-doubt, but she could face it. She had to. And as she took one last look out the window, watching the planes being prepared for the next flight, she realized that in a way, this was her own journey, one of growth, learning, and finding a way to do better. And when the phone call came later that afternoon, she would be ready to face whatever came next. The phone call came sooner than Emily expected. It was mid-afternoon when her phone buzzed, and she had been sitting in the break room, still lost in her thoughts, when she saw the name of the airline's HR representative flash across the screen. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. She had been dreading this call since she'd walked off the plane, and now that it was here, the reality of it felt even more intense. She took a deep breath before answering. Hello? Hi, Emily. This is Karen from Human Resources. I'm following up regarding the incident on Flight 209 this morning. Karen's voice was professional, but there was an unmistakable tone of concern. It was clear she had already been briefed on the situation. Emily's mind raced and she struggled to keep her voice steady. Yes, I'm aware of what happened. I've been reflecting on it all day. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I understand, Emily. I want to be upfront with you. The airline has taken your actions seriously. We've had a review of the situation, and I've spoken to both your supervisors and some of the passengers who were on board today. Emily's stomach dropped. She had known this was coming, but hearing it now made everything feel so much more real. You should know, Karen continued. We're committed to giving our staff the opportunity to improve, especially when there's a clear willingness to learn and grow. Based on your reflection and the conversations we've had with your team, we've decided not to terminate your employment. The words hit Emily like a wave, but it wasn't a relief, at least not immediately. Instead, she felt a mix of gratitude and shame, as if she had been given a second chance she didn't fully deserve. We're not letting this slide, though, Karen added firmly. There are a few things we need to address before you're back on the schedule. We're going to require a few additional training sessions focused on customer service, conflict resolution, and emotional intelligence. You'll also be shadowing senior staff for a while to ensure that you're applying these principles in real time. Emily nodded, even though Karen couldn't see her. I understand. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. There was another pause on the other end. I'm glad to hear that. We appreciate the fact that you've acknowledged the mistake and are committed to making it right. But I need you to understand that this is a critical turning point for your career here. If this kind of behavior repeats itself, it will be treated much more seriously. I understand, Emily repeated, her voice more steady now. I won't let it happen again. Good, Karen said. You'll hear from me soon with the specifics of the additional training. We'll be checking in with you periodically as well. Take this time to think about the importance of the work you do and how it impacts the passengers. The line went quiet for a moment before Karen's voice returned, softer now. We're giving you this opportunity because we believe in your potential, but the rest is up to you. I trust you'll take it seriously. With that, the call ended. Emily sat there for a few moments, still holding her phone, her hand shaking slightly. She wasn't sure what she had expected from the call, but hearing that she still had a chance, that her job wasn't over yet, it felt almost surreal. She had been expecting the worst, but instead she was being offered the opportunity to prove herself. A mix of emotions flooded her. Part of her was relieved. At least I still have a job. But another part felt the weight of the responsibility she had just been given. This wasn't a clean slate. It was a warning. She knew that. She had to work harder than ever to show that she could earn back the trust of her supervisors, her colleagues, and, most importantly, the passengers. Emily stood up, her legs feeling unsteady, and walked over to the window of the break room, looking out at the planes taking off. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the tarmac, and for a moment she felt like she was seeing the world through a new lens. Everything felt different now. She had made a mistake, but now she had the chance to rebuild, to change. The weight of her failure hadn't disappeared, but it didn't feel as overwhelming as it had earlier. There was still work to do, yes, but it felt like a mountain she could climb, one step at a time. She wasn't going to let this mistake define her. She had learned something invaluable today. She had learned that empathy and professionalism weren't just buzzwords. They were the foundation of her job. Without those, the rest of it didn't matter. She understood now that her role as a flight attendant was far more than simply serving drinks or following procedures. It was about human connection, about treating every passenger with respect and care, no matter the circumstances. It wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, moments of doubt, and likely more mistakes. But Emily was determined to do better. She knew it wouldn't be overnight, and she knew that the passengers she had wronged that day might never forget how she treated them. But she could work to rebuild her reputation, one action at a time. As she walked out of the break room, the buzz of the airport around her suddenly felt more like the backdrop to a new chapter in her life. She had been given a second chance, and this time, she wasn't going to take it for granted. The next flight she worked would be different, and that was a promise she made to herself. The following weeks were a blur of mixed emotions, long shifts, and challenging training sessions. Emily threw herself into her work with a single-minded focus, determined not to let the second chance she had been given slip through her fingers. It wasn't easy. Every moment she spent on the job now felt like a test, a way to prove to her colleagues, her supervisors, and most importantly, herself, that she could learn from her mistakes. The additional training sessions were grueling. They covered everything she had taken for granted before. The nuances of customer service, the importance of active listening, and how to handle stress without letting it affect the way you treated passengers. Emily struggled with some of the exercises, especially the role-playing scenarios where she had to de-escalate difficult situations. It felt like every muscle memory from her previous approach had to be unlearned. She had to remind herself that it wasn't just about solving problems. It was about making passengers feel heard and respected in the process. During these sessions, she also shadowed senior flight attendants. One of them, a woman named Jessica, took her under her wing. Jessica had been with the airline for over a decade, and her calm, composed demeanor was something Emily admired. Jessica was everything Emily aspired to be: patient, empathetic, and able to diffuse tension with nothing more than a calm word and a warm smile. It was clear that Jessica had a deep understanding of what it meant to care for passengers, not just as customers, but as people. "Every flight is a new opportunity," Jessica told her one day as they waited to board a flight. "You can't carry yesterday with you. If you've made a mistake, fix it. But don't let it define you. Don't let it follow you to the next flight." Emily had nodded, absorbing her words, but the reality of it felt difficult to grasp. How could she not let her past mistake follow her? How could she forget the passengers who had seen her fail? She thought of the elderly woman, still etched in her mind, and how her failure had affected more than just that one moment. But Jessica's words echoed in her thoughts. Every flight is a new opportunity. That became Emily's mantra. It wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and moving forward with a better mindset. Her first real test came about 2 weeks after the incident. She was assigned to a routine flight from Miami to Chicago. The flight was not particularly full, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. There was the usual bustle of boarding passengers, the typical requests for drinks and snacks, and the general chatter that accompanied every flight. Emily kept her head down, focused on her duties, determined to apply everything she had learned in training. Midway through the flight, an elderly woman in the aisle seat raised her hand. Emily's heart skipped. She hadn't expected it so soon, but there it was, the test. The memory of the elderly woman from her last flight surfaced in her mind, but she quickly pushed it aside. This was different. She was different now. Emily approached the woman slowly, giving herself time to center herself. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" she asked, her voice steady but warm. The elderly woman smiled up at her, a faint glimmer of relief in her eyes. "Could I please have a glass of water?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. Emily's heart steadied. The request was simple, but it was loaded with the weight of her past. She didn't hesitate this time. "Of course," she replied. "I'll get that for you right away." As she turned to walk to the galley, Emily took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. It wasn't just the request for water, it was everything behind it. This was a chance to demonstrate how much she had changed, how much she had learned. She returned with the water quickly and handed it to the woman with a smile. "Here you go, ma'am. Please let me know if you need anything else." The woman nodded gratefully, and Emily moved on, her heart still racing, but now with a feeling of pride instead of shame. The rest of the flight passed without incident, but that moment, that simple request for water, was a significant milestone for her. It wasn't just about serving the water, it was about how she had approached the situation. She had done it calmly, professionally, and without the weight of her past mistake hanging over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was starting to move forward. Over the next few flights, Emily continued to build on that experience. With each new passenger, she focused on providing the same level of service, approaching each request with patience and respect. The anxiety that had plagued her at the beginning of her return to work slowly began to fade. She wasn't perfect, and she knew there would still be difficult moments ahead, but she was learning to handle them differently. One of the hardest parts of her recovery, though, was facing her colleagues. Emily knew that the incident had affected how they saw her. It wasn't just the passengers who had witnessed the failure. It was the whole crew. They had seen her at her lowest, and now she had to show them that she was capable of more. It took time. There were quiet moments, like when Emily caught the sidelong glances from some of the more experienced crew members. But with each passing day, she grew more confident. She wasn't expecting a pat on the back or instant approval. But she felt the shift when a few of the senior attendants began to approach her with questions, with the kind of professionalism they expected from everyone. It wasn't just about the passengers anymore. It was about her relationship with the team as well. One afternoon, after a particularly smooth flight, Jessica approached Emily in the break room. Emily had just finished going over some notes for her next shift and was surprised to see Jessica standing by the door. "You're doing well," Jessica said, her tone warm but direct. I've been watching you on the past few flights, and I've noticed a real difference. You've taken everything to heart, and it shows." Emily blinked, surprised by the compliment. It wasn't often that Jessica offered praise. She was a no-nonsense type of person, and Emily had learned to respect her straightforward approach. "Thank you," Emily replied, her voice a little softer than usual. "I've been trying." Jessica nodded. "Just keep that attitude. Don't forget that it's about the people, not the job itself. You've got what it takes. Don't let anything or anyone make you forget that." For the first time since the incident, Emily felt a deep sense of relief. She still had a long way to go, but this moment felt like a validation of the work she had put in to improve. Jessica's approval, however small, meant something. She knew that the real test was ongoing. There would always be moments when she'd have to prove that she had truly learned. But for now, Emily felt like she was heading in the right direction. The road ahead wasn't easy, and it wasn't going to be without its bumps. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt hopeful about the future. She had made a mistake, yes, but she had also made the decision to rise from it, to learn from it, and to continue her work with the kind of empathy and respect that her role demanded. And with that determination, she knew she was building a better version of herself. A version that wouldn't let her past mistakes define her, but rather fuel her growth. The months that followed marked a turning point in Emily's career, and in many ways her life. The mistakes she had made, the embarrassment she had felt, and the guilt that had consumed her were now fading into the background, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. She had worked hard, learning from every challenge, every misstep, and every moment of self-doubt. But what mattered most wasn't how long it had taken to recover. It was the fact that she had chosen to get back up, time and time again. Her confidence had slowly returned, but it wasn't the same kind of confidence she had once had. This was different. It wasn't built on pride or a sense of superiority. It was the kind of confidence that came from knowing the value of humility, the importance of listening, and the power of empathy. Emily had discovered that what made her a good flight attendant wasn't her ability to serve drinks or handle a boarding process. It was her ability to connect with people, to make them feel heard, to offer kindness when it was most needed, to remain calm in the face of stress, and, above all, to never forget that everyone on that plane had a story, a need, a voice. One day, a few months after her initial mistake, Emily found herself assigned to a long-haul flight to Los Angeles. It wasn't her first long flight since her return, but it felt like a milestone. The long hours in the air gave her time to think, to reflect on how far she had come. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, she stood in the galley, preparing a beverage cart, when a passenger approached. He was in his mid-50s, well-dressed but looking a bit weary, his eyes bloodshot. He had the sort of demeanor that suggested he had just returned from a long business trip, or perhaps something else that had worn him down. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice slightly raspy. "Could I get a glass of water?" Emily smiled at him, the simple request feeling like a small victory. This time it wasn't the request that was significant. It was how she approached it. She moved quickly, offering a glass of water with a sincere smile. "Of course, sir, here you go." The man looked at her with a faint, tired smile. "Thank you," he said, then added, almost as an afterthought, "You know, it's not often you get such a kind response from a flight attendant. Most just go through the motions." Emily paused for a moment, surprised by the comment. "I guess I try to make it a little more personal," she said, shrugging slightly. "After all, we're all in this together, right?" He nodded, his eyes softening. "You're right. It's easy to forget that sometimes. We get caught up in our own stuff. But it's nice to feel like someone cares." Her heart tightened slightly. It was a small comment, but it meant something. It reminded her of why she was here. Not just to serve, but to connect. To bring a little bit of humanity into an often impersonal experience. As she turned to walk away, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face. Jessica, one of the senior flight attendants, watching her from the galley doorway. Jessica didn't say anything, but she offered a brief nod of approval. Emily's chest tightened with pride. It was small, but it was enough. It was a sign that she had earned the respect she had been working so hard to regain. The rest of the flight passed without incident, and by the time they were preparing to land in Los Angeles, Emily felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in months. She had faced her challenges, both internal and external. She had learned the hard way, but she had learned. The passengers who flew with her now didn't see the mistakes from months ago. They saw someone who genuinely cared about their experience, and that was enough. After the plane landed, Emily stood by the galley, waiting for the crew to disembark. As the last of the passengers left the plane, she took a moment to look out the window. The bright lights of Los Angeles flickered below, the city alive with possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she had the power to shape her future. As she gathered her things and walked off the plane with the rest of the crew, she was greeted by Kelly, the supervisor who had been with her since the beginning of her recovery. Kelly gave her a look, almost as if she was reading Emily's thoughts. "You did good today," she said simply. "Keep it up." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of those words more than she had before. The approval wasn't what she was after. It wasn't about the praise anymore. It was about the process, the commitment, and the knowledge that she was becoming the person she wanted to be. Her work wasn't done, of course. There would always be more challenges ahead, more moments of uncertainty and growth. But Emily now knew that mistakes were part of the journey, not the destination. She had learned that mistakes didn't define her. They shaped her. They taught her what it meant to be human. And it was that humanity that she could now offer to every passenger she served, every interaction she had. She had started as someone who made a mistake, someone who let stress and frustration cloud her judgment. But she was leaving that flight as someone who understood the value of patience, the importance of empathy, and the power of a simple act of kindness. She had learned that being a good flight attendant wasn't just about getting the job done. It was about how you made people feel along the way. As Emily walked toward the terminal with the rest of the crew, she knew there was still more to learn. But for the first time, she felt ready for whatever came next. She was no longer defined by her past mistakes. She was defined by how she rose from them, and that, she realized, was what truly mattered. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.